I know we didn't pull together like a huge bulleted thing, but who cares? Let's just run with it.
I think the goal is to get me and Alvin to yell at each other back and forth.
Yeah.
You're wrong. I'm gonna cancel you, Josh.
No, you're being canceled.
We got a little cancel thing when we say something wrong. Canceled.
Just muting you guys. Jason, just mute them if they say something you don't like. Welcome, everyone, to the Restoring Our City podcast. On this special episode, one of our guests and collaborators will be canceled at the end of this episode. So whoever wins gets to stay on the mic, and whoever doesn't will be canceled forever. And they're not allowed to go in.
Goodbye.
You are the weakest link. That's a reference for anybody who's over 30 years old. Well, we are excited to talk about this really important topic, I think controversial topic. And I think we've seen it all on social media, but cancel culture. And I have my fellow collaborators with me, and I'm excited to jump into this topic with them. We've got Josh Kuruvilla. Wow, I didn't pronounce your name right.
Wow, you don't even know
You've been
him.
Canceled, Joby. You pronounced my name.
Josh Kuruvilla is with us. Josh, have you ever been canceled from anything in your life before?
Yeah, I had this podcast I did with a couple guys on.
You're canceled for a whole season.
Season 2, I really missed out on. They wrote me out. They killed me off the show.
We're back to life. You know, we're still in that Easter spirit. So Josh, thank you for being on. I appreciate your insight into this. I think when we talk about cancel culture and how it impacts society in general, I think it's really important. I'm sure we've all kind of seen it. Alvin Mathew, thank you for being on as well. Love to get your insight. What's your perspective on cancel culture? Have you ever experienced it? Did someone try to cancel you at all?
No, I've been very careful to not be canceled. So luckily it hasn't happened yet. Like TBD, we'll see if it happens eventually.
We'll see after this podcast. Like everybody just unfollows you and unsubscribes from you.
Man. All my 10 followers. Yeah.
That's our goal in life, right? It's just to get more clout.
Yeah, 11 followers. Next subscriber limit.
Well, I mean, I hope people don't unsubscribe, but like actually gain something from this and learn a little bit about cancel culture. Why is it important, and why is it even worth talking about? I think this is interesting because I actually did read a stat from Yahoo News. This was a poll that came out last summer where it said that most Americans, 56% of them, actually think that cancel culture in the US is actually a very big problem or somewhat big problem. And it looks like there's a pretty significant chunk that think that this is worth talking about. And so I think we've seen things on the news, or if you're on Twitter and you get into that cesspool sometimes where you could see with something trending or somebody's not going to be on a TV show or a movie anymore because they've been canceled. So it's really interesting about how this aspect of cancel culture plays into our Christian worldview and even our perspectives on faith and things that we can say and what we can't say. So maybe let's start there. Like, guys, what's just kind of your perspectives on cancel culture? Josh, maybe like from your perspective, when you hear that word, what's kind of the first things that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think I always think of like the worst case scenario of like just intense scenarios where people are like, saying really unacceptable things where they be, racially motivated or, other types of comments. And, the group of people that are out there on social media and that, it's just all of us just saying, no, we don't want that as part of our culture. Right. It's a little bit of a correction, whether you like it or not, or kind of a control of the people, right? And so I think it's an interesting concept, and I think there's more power in the individual. Like, it's not an individual thing typically with cancel culture. It's a group of people coming together, but it's got to be a couple people that kind of lead the charge, right? So I think it's an interesting thing, and I don't know that it could happen the same way 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. Like, it's not just that one person with Alvin. You mentioned 10 followers. I mean, like, are you going to be really canceling somebody?
Right.
But maybe it's a spark that gets someone somewhere. But and all joking aside, Alvin, you are a leader, and you've been a leader in our community for a long time. So I think what you say in your circles of influence, like within your church, might sway people one way or another. But like, what's kind of
Yeah.
the first things that come to mind when you think about this concept?
Yeah, I think, well, the first probably example I could think of was, or at least maybe the most recent in recent history, was the Harvey Weinstein episodes, right? Where I think that was probably where all of it sort of started, I guess, the popularity of the cancel culture. And in that situation, I would say, like, oh, that's great. There's someone who's in a position of power that is like working behind the scenes, who's getting financed through these various means where people are supporting him because he's got his hands in everything, where he actually turns out to be this like abuser and basically a very bad person who people tried to cancel him to then like take away that power. I think, hey, that makes sense. Now I think more recently the trend has kind of shifted toward or that same method has shifted toward anyone who has like just done something that for that moment in time is not the most popular opinion. So there are, people who like maybe it's not actually something worth being canceled for, but it's maybe not like it's countered a popular belief, if I'm trying to be careful and not get canceled by using examples, but like, say there's like someone disagrees with your religious belief or the prevailing religious belief, then if they believe opposite that, then obviously, like it seems like, oh, we'd cancel them, or vice versa, or say, things that wouldn't necessarily be worth being canceled over might be happening now, I guess. But at the same time, I think in its purest form is like that Harvey Weinstein case where you cancel something because, hey, there's something seriously wrong. We're trying to bring a lot of attention to it. So I don't know if we're still doing that now or the degrees of which we're doing it now.
Yeah.
But yeah, but
No,
that's
interesting.
kind of what comes to my mind. But yeah.
No, it's a good example. I feel like even with the Me Too movement that kind of sparked off a few years ago, and even till today, I feel like we take aspects of how we try to tackle problems and controversial things and really significantly dangerous things, and we try to handle it and hold people accountable. So I guess maybe that's a question there. Is there any value to cancel culture? Is there a pros and cons piece of this that we can say, hey, there's some things that we can actually find useful, and if there are there other parts of it that are really dangerous?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, in the way that Alvin was talking about with like Harvey Weinstein and sexual assault and mistreatment of women, or in other cases of mistreatment of minorities or different groups, like I think that's not culturally acceptable, right? And so I think there is a place for accountability, public accountability, especially if you're a public figure or a company or a corporation, right? I think where it gets dangerous is when we're talking about that situation that Alvin's talking about of like, oh, I'm going to cancel a group or people that I just disagree with, right? Like we can have differing views on certain topics, and it's not fair or right for me to then take all my energy and all my friends' energy and all my network's energy to try and, squelch out that other person's voice, right? But that's where it gets a little bit, kind of into this judgment zone of things of like, well, who's making that judgment? Who gets to choose? But I think the interesting piece of it is kind of going back to a podcast that we talked about on money is like, cancel culture has been something that's been around forever, right? Like, the way we put the term on it or what we call it today is just the new viral thing. But it's like, yeah, if you don't like what somebody, if you go to a church and you don't like what they say, you don't cancel them, but you go somewhere else, right? But now social media allows you to connect with other people and do that on a broader scale. And I think the interesting thing is really the dollars, right? Right. I always bring it back to the money, but the reality is that spending your money responsibly and in a way that doesn't support violence and really racially biased things or just unfair treatment of workers or employees or products that you don't want to see. that could be a good thing.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's really nuanced, right? It's like it kind of depends on the circumstance and the scenario. But I feel like there is a business component to this. There's an economic component to this where, you could cancel someone and it could really impact not only their livelihood and their finances, but also, an industry or a company or corporation overall, right? And like, who has the power to do that? It's like the loudest voice in the room sometimes. And sometimes now in the age that we live in, if you have a social media platform, you can be the loudest person in the room, not necessarily the authority or like the wisest person to discern if you're accountable or not, right? It's just like, wow, I got 1 million followers. I don't like this. Let's get rid of this person, right? That's kind of scary, isn't it? It's a little scary, but at the same time, it's like, do we have room in our culture for it? Is there room in our culture for it? Any value in that, right? Especially with these platforms like Twitter and YouTube and all these kind of things, right?
Like people like aggregating together to like push forward their opinions. Something happens like all over society, right? And like this is just the reverse, right? So it's like you're putting down somebody's voice or a company's voice or a person's voice because you've all come together and agreed that they just don't deserve that or that power or whatever it may be, right? You even think about like from a political perspective, people coming together, putting a ton of money together to make sure gun laws pass or to make sure, certain, laws or things in society stay the way that they are. And so, people doing that on social media isn't inherently a bad thing. It just can get out of control, just like anything else.
Yeah. And I think that's it's like a fabric of our society, right? Like it's like we collectively come together to do something. But I like the way you said that, Josh. It's like we're doing the reverse now. It's like we are almost intentionally trying to snuff out dissenting opinions. Yeah. And like that seems like counterintuitive to me because like why can't if there's something wrong in the culture, we should definitely bring it up and call it out to an extent. But why can't we make the right choices elevated, right? Why can't we elevate the wiser choices and the right paths forward more than, hey, let's snuff this out? It's like we I don't know, we just put together all this energy to really push someone out of the picture, right?
Yeah.
I think it's just easier to call out the negative, right? Like, I don't know, even in my job, it's like you got to always find what's wrong. Nobody cares to highlight the good thing. And like I've even gotten feedback sometimes of like, oh, like you only give feedback when like there's something wrong. And I'm like, well, that's the way my brain works. Cause I'm like, well, that's how we can get better. Right. If I tell you all the great things you're already doing, like, what is that doing for anybody? But
that's such an Asian attitude.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm Indian. Okay.
All right. Sorry. And I mean, just to kind of like piggyback a little bit on what like Joby and Josh have kind of been saying, I think cancel culture has its potential to be good. But especially when like, I'll give you a quick example with like money. There's an incident with like a YouTuber, I think that happened like a month ago, who he's like he's like in a group of like young people as YouTubers, and he's probably like the lead. I won't say the name for sake of the stories could change over time.
Everybody knows who you're talking about, Alvin.
I do.
Say
oh, okay.
Yeah. You guys are too young. I don't watch YouTube like
I know
you guys
Joby
do.
doesn't. I was just trying to be nice to him. Right.
I know that's
there's this guy. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. So basically, there was like some allegations against someone in his group, and instead of going after the person who did what was wrong in the group, they went after the main guy in charge because he had all the money and all the endorsements.
David Dobrik.
Yeah. So basically went after him. He didn't do anything wrong, and then all of his like main sponsors within 2 days immediately cut ties with him. And this is a guy who like built hundreds of millions of dollars. Anyone like millennial and Gen Z younger know these guys and know these kids. And like people were like going after this kid David, and like there was barely any response toward the actual guy who did the allegations of abuse. And
wow.
And so it was like, well, like, I mean, cancel culture is good in this situation. Yes, you should go after the right person, though, and, finish their financial opportunities if that's enabling them to do wrong. But I think sometimes it can get twisted to, oh, let's just go to where the most money is and we can make the so-called biggest impact in our cancel culture,
Yeah, but I think the other piece of that, too, and especially that specific scenario is like, you have to look at who did the wrong and then who enabled that
Right.
environment.
Absolutely.
And I
Yeah.
think
Right.
that's the piece that people wanted to make I think a bigger statement about was like, hey,
Yeah.
you enabled this to happen. You created this environment where, just using David Drobe, continuing
Right.
on that example, you created this environment that, hey, content is above everything, right?
Right.
And that can be dangerous. And just like in that scenario, it was really dangerous. And you have to still put value on the people first before you put value on like anytime you think of business, the way I always think is like the people are the most valuable piece,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what business you're doing, even if you're selling a product. And
Yeah.
if you create an environment where the people aren't valued, um, then it's dangerous and it's going to lead to bad things. And just because you're a 25-year-old kid doesn't mean that, well, you have $1 million company, whether you want
Right.
to
Yeah.
say it or not,
Right. Right. Right.
millions of dollars. And so that's the dangerous piece. But I think the tough part is, where's the room for learning and growth, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
the epitome of canceling somebody is saying, oh, I'm using a really, crazy example, is like, you murdered somebody or you committed a crime, we're canceling your life, we're putting you in
Yeah.
prison, or we're ending your life. That's what society has
Mm-hmm.
decided at times, right? But biblically, is that right? Or is that just right as human beings to just like, hey, let's just turn off somebody's future because
Yeah.
they made a mistake? And I think sometimes it may be right, given the gravity of the mistake and the victims involved and what they did they know how they did it? Were they actively doing it even though they knew it was wrong? But then you get into these nuanced scenarios of like, okay, can this person still exist and learn and move forward, um, while still helping the victims? Maybe I don't know what the right answer is, because I don't think society's even figured out how to deal with these
Mm.
situations. But I think the reality is it's much more complex. But we have to start thinking about, can we just end somebody abruptly? Is that the
Right.
right thing to do in these more nuanced scenarios?
That makes me think of, we had an episode with a friend of our show, Alvin Newman, and he works with a prison fellowship, and he talked about this concept of restorative justice, right? Like we don't even we don't approach people with restoration in mind, with even the title of our organization, Restoring Our City. Like,
Mm-hmm.
people, all of us included, have made mistakes, and there's got to be room for restoration, no matter the gravity, even from a Christian perspective. But it's like we don't look at people who make mistakes from a restorative standpoint. And like we just look to hold them accountable for that mistake. And then that's it. There's no like looking beyond that. I think that's a
Yeah.
very great way to look at it, Josh. It's like, where's the human aspect in here? We're just kind of looking at the scenario itself and taking the human element out. And I don't want to make that sound like we're not holding people accountable, because I feel like that there's a little bit of gray area here, right? Like holding people accountable and
Yeah.
canceling, right? What's the difference?
I was just going to say, I almost think like cancel culture is like accountability without love, right?
Yeah.
It's just
Ooh.
like it's accountability, but it's harsh, right? Because it lacks like, these people don't care about you, right? They're just telling you, oh, we're going to shut this person off. It's not like, Joby, if I felt like you were doing something wrong or you felt like I was doing something wrong, like, how would we approach it? Will we post it on
Mm-hmm.
social media and say, everybody stop funding Joby's job, hey, fire this guy?
Yeah.
But like, that's what people are doing when it's public figures, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is, like, the way I'd approach you if I felt you were doing something wrong is like, hey, Joby, do you have time to connect? Like, and I would pull you to the side. It's the same way I give employees feedback at work. It's like, I don't blast them in the front of the room,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
it's become okay to, especially with public figures, to blast them on social media, without caring about who they are, right? And I think the one phrase that I've had in my head since the beginning of this year, with everything that's going on in the world, is like, we have to seek to understand in
Yep.
everything that
Mm-hmm.
we do, right? And I think so much of our world has just turned into, oh, I'm going to respond to people's actions without seeking to understand where they're coming from or what happened. Um, and I think that's the dangerous part to me, is accountability without caring or without love. and that just is empty, right? And it's almost feels like hatred. And I think that's why 56% of Americans think it's a problem, right? Because it's just saying, hey, I don't agree with you, or you did something wrong, you're dead to me. And that's definitely not biblical. From the multitude of stories we could talk about, the prodigal son, or
Right.
he was who was without sin cast the first stone. Like, we could think of all these variants, right? But it's just empty, right? It just feels empty of like, I don't care about you. Let's just shut you off.
Yeah. And I think that's so important to note because, like, even from a biblical perspective, like, I think society as a whole, if you don't identify as a Christian, you might really be perturbed by something that you see online and you're like, wow, I don't want to hear that ever again. And I want to do everything I can to boycott, protest, or just remove this person from society. But as a Christian, as we identify as Christians, and when we look at scripture and we see these examples, like you quoted, Josh, I think there's so much there that, I think even Jesus demonstrated how, like, even if somebody makes a mistake, that redemptive work and that restorative work that he does to the tax collectors, the prostitutes, and people who are technically canceled in the culture. But like we see this in our society now, right? Like whether it's our, even with this podcast, right? Like we have to really be careful. Sometimes we talk about it offline, or if I'm not recording and we're just bantering back and forth, we're like, man, we got to be careful what we say. Because even if it's controversial or not, like society might move the goalposts a little bit and say, well, that thing about your faith. And I think this is where even Christians and maybe conservative Christians kind of get up in arms. So cancel culture is like, I won't be able to talk about my faith anymore. Like, can I, if I really fundamentally believe something about my faith and I express those views, even though you might not think it's in love, I think it's still in love, but you're going to almost deem it hate speech, right? And then come after me, right? That's a little scary. And like, do you think there's any merit to that? Like Alvin, like being in the church and like seeing, young people, or even in youth ministry, or even just leading at church, like this fear of cancel culture that they're, oh man, they're out to get me, or is that just all conspiracy?
Yeah, I think that's kind of tough because there's an aspect, at least like, being a mature Christian, you realize that, they didn't crucify Jesus because they really liked him, right? Like they crucified him because like clearly he spoke the truth in probably the most loving way possible, but it was still offensive to the way that people who do not believe live their lives, right? So for us as Christians now in the 21st century, like how do we deal with that? It's I would kind of piggyback off of what Josh said, is that you first seek to understand. And I have no desire to get on Twitter and blast any organization or something I'm not specifically tied with for the sake of canceling them. But if someone like a brother, or say like a company I work with, is doing something wrong, then I would say, hey, let's talk about this and let's figure out like what the heck, like I can't stand for this. If we can't resolve, then yes, obviously, you step away from it. But for sharing your faith and for just there's a way to talk about the truth of Jesus and the love of God without being offensive to people you don't know. But now I'm not discounting that, like, hey, if there are people close in your circle and you have to get like real, you're allowed to get real with them because they have that relationship with you, and you can do that in love because you actually love that person, right? Versus some stranger on Twitter. I don't love some stranger on Twitter, or I'm not in that kind of relationship where I wouldn't need to go that hard trying to cancel you or trying to say something, because I don't feel like that would be effective, right? So it's, I think, understanding what media we're using to convey that, and being like on the real, I think it's just an excuse for people to say like, oh, that's why I can't share my faith.
Yeah.
Because no, I'll get canceled.
Interesting.
Oh, it's too hard. No, you know what I mean? Like if we're being really honest, how many of you are actually posting things on Twitter that's like, oh man, you're gonna get canceled for how faithful you are?
Yeah, it's like they've never posted something about God before. It's like, well, now
like, no,
I definitely won't.
I can't do it. Yeah,
I saw a funny meme about that on Easter where people are all like posting all these like rap lyrics or like, I'm gonna kill you and do all this kind of stuff. But then when it's Easter weekend, it's like, he is risen, everybody, he is risen. It's like, okay, who are you really?
I think it was Carlos Witt put something on Twitter where he was basically like, he's like, I have a good friend that's on the right side of the aisle politically and a good friend that's on the left side of the aisle politically. And basically, he's like, a week before Easter, he's like, both of them basically like said the worst possible things they could about the other person, but they both on Easter Sunday said, like, everyone praise the Lord, Jesus is risen, we're all saved. And he's like, so I have a question for you. He's like, how on earth, what do you post on Monday after, you know, the week before you're trash talking people you don't agree with, but somehow you're a Christian on Easter? You know, it's like, okay, you know, we got to check where we're really presenting ourselves as.
Well, I think that's like interesting, Alvin. It kind of has like a question that I had was like sometimes people like to think, especially from a religious side of things, that like the world, or especially in Western culture, I'm speaking more to that, is like, oh, they hate the core tenets of Christianity.
Mm,
But I don't really think that's the case. Like people talk about it as like, oh, I can't talk about my faith. And I'm like, you can't talk about love. You can't talk about
yeah.
caring about other people. You can't talk about, just Jesus and who he was. Like, I don't think most people like argue about that or get too worked up if you're talking about Jesus or your religion. I think
Yeah.
what happens is like, oh, I don't believe in abortion, or I don't
Right.
think that LGBTQ people should be acknowledged, in the most
Hmm.
dramatic sense, or be allowed to be married. And I
Hmm.
think what happens is we have a lot of these fringe conversations that relate to our faith, but they're not the foundation of our faith. And they're like, oh, I can't talk about those things. I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts of like, do you agree with that? Or, do you think there's like people are afraid to talk about the core tenets of Christianity? And again, more so in the Western culture in America.
I think there's an element of that where yes, I feel like people are not sharing their faith to really share their faith, like with the intentional purpose of
Yeah.
drawing someone closer to Jesus. But I think there is like a cultural shift, right? Like not want to get into all the like postmodernism and just the way our culture is shifting. And I think people are nervous about that, and actually rightfully so, because some of the core ideas like and the frameworks of like our worldview and like how we come to understand our faith is really polar opposite from what the culture is, right? And like when you get into those deep conversations, but how often are you getting into those deep conversations on
Hmm.
Twitter,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
like there's an element to like say yes, and for the folks who are nervous about like, hey, they might be canceling Christianity in the Western world, like I think there's an element of that if you understand like the worldviews and like foundationally like where are things coming from. But like if you were speaking about the core truths of the gospel, and I think we are very fortunate compared to the rest of the world, right? To
Hmm.
like compare to China. I mean, we have the freedom to worship in public, and I know with Corona and all these kind of things that added an element to people like, hey, wow, you can't worship in public, but they're letting you do dance parties in the streets. And I think there are things and there's nuances to the conversation where you can kind of pick apart, but I feel like it's not as prevalent in some of the public spheres if you are really intentionally trying to share your faith. But there's an element I think about the ideas of Christianity that people are rightfully concerned about.
Yeah. I think even just to add on what you guys are saying, if we're contrasting Western Christianity versus Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, like easily summarized, is more about like comfort. It's like Jesus can be your savior and he can save you and you can live your best life, or you can, Jesus can make your life better. Versus in the East, like Christianity, or the message of the gospel is about no salvation. Like you're going to die, you're going to go to hell. Like this is the way, like it's a lot more radical. But because of that, the outworkings are a lot more radical. So on the Western side of things, we take for granted that like, oh, we're in a Judeo-Christian like worldview, like an atmosphere in America, and we kind of take for granted that like, yeah, well, we're kind of Christian, and we almost put our faith in like that. Oh yeah, like because like we're generally okay as a society because we kind of believe these Christian-ish values. That once people start in the West see them start to erode for what they really are, is that we don't actually follow Judeo-Christian values to the core. then they get like panicked because they place their faith in like the culture and the government is what's going to maintain Christianity. When obviously like Christians know the only thing that maintains Christianity is God, right? It's
Right.
the word is sufficient to defend itself. So from our standpoint, when people on the West are like freaked out about like Christianity, like or the values being eroded or any of that, there is a little truth to the fact that now it's becoming more obvious that people are taking a stronger stance against classically held Christian like social issues. But like Josh was saying, the core tenets of the faith, you can like talk about love. You can talk about how Jesus died for all sinners and how we all are sinners and we all need a savior. So in that sense, I think we can still share our faith. But the idea that like, we're worried about, oh, we'll lose our values or we'll lose Christianity's hold in the West is, I don't think there was really much of a hold in the first place.
I think that conversation can get very deep when we talk about like which part of that conversation are we sharing? Like, but kind of getting back to even cancel culture. And Jason, our wonderful producer behind the scenes, has just put in some notes here that I do want to read. A couple like just pros and cons. One pro that I think we got from literally procon.org that says one pro of cancel culture is, and it refers to it as call out culture allows marginalized people to seek accountability where the justice system fails. And that's an interesting note. And then one con is that call out culture amounts to online bullying and can incite violence and threats, even worse than the original offense being called out. I thought that was really interesting. And is there something nuanced about the fact that this is online? Like, I think you alluded to this, Alvin, like people are really like not gun shy to come after you on Twitter, but like, aren't these conversations really, really different when you're in front of a person having coffee and you have a disagreement, but you can still walk away as friends?
Yeah, because online there's less accountability.
Yeah. And I can't punch you if you're in a computer screen, whereas if you're standing in front of me,
People are
like
so
you're not worried
brave
about someone trying to
online.
swing at you. Yeah,
yeah.
Like, what do you mean?
I think it's so interesting where like even this whole idea of cancel culture, and we're primarily talking about it from an internet standpoint, right? Like from a social media standpoint, people are in waves trying to cancel you because there's no accountability, right? Like you don't even have to expound on your point. You just do it in 140 characters, and that's your target, right? And that's how you try to get rid of somebody. It's just strange.
Well, I mean, that reminds me of what happened with like the Chris Pratt, like the best Chris. Do you see that on Twitter? There's this there's this like meme poll that's like you have 4 things, and then one has to go. So it's just like, it's supposed to be funny, but then they did the 4 Chris's of like, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then everyone like piled on Chris Pratt as like the one to go. But then they took it even further and said, oh yeah, he's associated with this church, so he probably hates these people, like gays. He probably hates this, and it railed on stuff. And he's like, he didn't do anything. It was just a game. But like it got to the point of where like what's it? Robert Downey Jr. got on Twitter. He's like, hey guys, be nice to Chris. Is a good dude. He's one of my best. Like you guys got to chill with this. Where it's like, and Chris Pratt obviously didn't say anything because like they're just an internet meme. You know what I mean? But like it snowballed into this like crazy, like it's not a real canceling, but like in that same vein of like, oh, what the heck?
Oh yeah, but it could be, right? It could evolve to that because like, wow, look at the mass amount of people that don't like you. You're not going to be as marketable for our next movie, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's, I'm almost tempted to tell people not to subscribe to this podcast, a fear of blowing up, and then you'll find a tweet from me from when I was like 20 years old or whatever. I mean, Twitter didn't exist.
Delete all your old tweets now.
Yes.
Delete everything.
I'm sure there's a website that captured it already. But it's strange, right? Like even in that article that I was reading, it was like the 16-year-old kid who got accepted to Harvard, then got rescinded his offer from Harvard. Well, he wasn't 16 when he got into Harvard, but they found a tweet from when he was 16, and they rescinded his offer, and he apologized and all this kind of stuff. But it's like, man, these old tweets come back to haunt you. But it's something about the internet, right? Like this facade and this wall that's in front of us that does not allow us to actually have full dialogue with each other, which almost creates and spawns this, I don't know, this lack of empathy and lack of love and all those attributes, Josh, you were talking about. It's like all of those things are now removed when I don't see the person in front of me. I just see your profile picture. You know, there's this lack of
and
humanity.
it's like, I mean, like, I don't know what the 16-year-old said, so not
Right.
specific comment on that, but it's hard for me to think that like a mistake you made when you're 16 should live with you forever, you know, and impact your life in totality. What growth is not, growth does not exist without failure, right? Like you can't learn something if you haven't learned it through a tough lesson, right? Like you can't learn everything from everyone else, right? We're not perfect. We'll never be perfect. That's not who we are. We're fundamentally flawed as human beings in one way, shape, or form. And if someone appears perfect to you, you just don't know their sin or their shortcoming. Like that's all it is. And so I think that's the humanity piece of all of this, is like, we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard, right? It's like, I got to be really sure before I cancel somebody, right? And I think the online piece you were talking about, Joby, allows you to do it at a whim, at a disconnected way. But it's like, I wouldn't feel good about doing that unless I really knew what was going on and knew that person, right? I think, I think we talked about it, Joby, but like, putting the money behind things and spending your money wisely and not spending your money on for companies who are doing the wrong thing or something you don't believe in. I think that's fine, right? Like accountability from a corporate perspective. Like I think we can boycott and cancel corporations. That's been happening for generations. That's nothing new. But to boycott and cancel people for a mistake or an action, that's not some of this repeating, grand issues that we're talking about with the Harvey Weinsteins and some of the greater cases, is maybe more of a reflection on us than it is on the person that we cancel.
It's a great point. And I think it really brings it back to the Christian perspective. How do we treat each other? Right. And I don't know how many times Jesus even says in the Gospels, love one another. And it's just this fundamental attribute of Christians to treat each other as image bearers. Image bearers, we are all designed in the image of God. And I think we have to really treat people that way. And that does not discount accountability. But I think that's a really great point. But seek to understand. I love that. I think that we need to do more of that in our society today. Thank you, guys. I'm glad that nobody got canceled. I don't think we said anything that dumb on this episode.
We'll find out in 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. I'm sure. We'll see if we're around still. Hopefully we can make it to the end of season 3.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I appreciate you guys jumping on and talking about this, and look forward to more controversial topics in the future.
Make sure you like, comment, and cancel.
Uncheck that bell. Just kidding. All right, guys. Thanks a lot.